All right, very good. Thanks very much. Again, Steve Posnack. If you didn't catch me yesterday, I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Technology at HHS in the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. I leave that on my voicemail, and then I tell people to email me because I'm part of a generation that doesn't listen to voicemails anymore. So I'm going to cover in detail, I think, the only policy-labeled session in the time book out that's in there for your handouts. The API condition of certification, some of the technical details, give you a little bit of a nuanced look at what we went into for our proposed rule. The one thing I should note, about a week ago, our comment period closed, and so maybe I'll do a little bit of audience participation. How many of you commented on our rule? All right, maybe a 50-50 split. Thank you for commenting, one of the 2,000. And rest assured, we read through all of them. So I just wanted to make sure that you didn't feel like you were sending it into a dead letter mailbox or anything else like that. We have a team of folks ever expanding at ONC that are participating in our regulatory activities. As I mentioned, we got 2,000 comments. That's about 4 times as much as we've ever received on any of our prior regulations in the past decade. That will roughly equate to somewhere between, say, 10 and 20,000 pages of comments that we'll need to read. Often, there are a few that are, specific paragraph type submissions, but then there are others that are 50 to 100 pages worth of response back to us. So as much pain as we inflict on everyone by, putting out a 700-page regulation, we receive back probably the order of magnitude in response, which is great. Wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, in terms of things that we missed, things that we were vague about, some of which you'll probably see through my presentation, and you'll be like, oh, you guys didn't really explain that very well. That's what we use as part of the final rule process to make sure that we include as much regulatory clarity for the regulated community when it's time for implementation and compliance, but also for those of you that will be implementing technology solutions that will interact with the organizations with whom we have regulatory authority. It's equally important for you to understand what their obligations are going to be and how they will need to behave in the policy environment that we have. So, as I mentioned the other day, we have 2 statutory sections that are really important from the 21st Century Cures Act. Again, they were part of the act that was passed in 2016, so it's the kind of long tail of execution as part of the executive branch. The first section of the Cures Act that I talk about are what are called the conditions of certification. So the quick synopsis here, the certification program, the ONC Health IT certification program, up to this date has really focused on just the software. So we call it standards conformance, how the software itself behaves, does it meet certain functional requirements that are expressed in our certification criteria, and then does it include the particular standards that may be referenced for interoperability related purposes. Congress changed the paradigm now, and our authority, as we like to say in executive branch speak, to also include the business practices that are associated with health IT developers. And so that's what these conditions of certification really apply in a general sense. So when you think or you hear us reference conditions of certification, think health IT developers. And so the easiest juxtaposition here is that you could have a perfectly standards conformant certified product, and then the developer could do something from a business practice perspective that would be, contravene, as my policy colleagues like to say, that would violate one of these conditions of certification. The developer would be held accountable. The certifications that could be issued to their product could be at jeopardy based on their behavior associated with the conditions of certification. So one of the ones that's easy to reference would be the real-world testing there, 17405. There's an obligation that Congress included as part of this condition of certification that health IT developers that get certified through our program participate in real-world testing. We identified particular certification criteria that would be in scope for this particular testing. If a developer were to fail to engage in real-world testing, they would violate this condition of certification. And even though their product had been certified and had met the actual technical requirements of the certification criteria, their participation in the program would be in jeopardy. And we have a due process and corrective action approach going forward. But it's just to show you kind of the distinguishing characteristics and how now we'll be going at the developer business practices level, so to speak, with the conditions of certification. This presentation is going to focus specifically on 17404, which is the API condition of certification. I'm going to do the deep dive focused on that. So our role as a regulator was to describe the exceptions to the general rule that information needs to be exchanged. And so we laid out a number of different exceptions, 7 in total, to make it clear for the regulated community as best we could, absent your public comments, that there would be certain situations where it would be okay to not exchange electronic health information. And the one that I usually pick on as my poster child example is the last one there, 171.207. We recognize that there would be certain situations where healthcare providers, health IT developers would take their systems down for regular maintenance, security patches, things of that nature that would be kind of regular due diligence of making sure that software was kept up to date. And if the system was down for that period of time and somebody's app queried for data and they didn't get the data, we didn't want the finger to be pointed at that health IT developer, healthcare provider saying, they're an information blocker, I asked for information, they didn't give me the information, thus, they violated the law. We wanted to establish certain parameters by which it would be acceptable to have your system down and have that electronic health information be inaccessible. So that's the high-level overview of kind of 2 years' worth of explanation in terms of how we try to implement the law. These two sections, again, have a lot of interplay, and I'm going to cover that interplay in a little bit more from a big picture perspective first. So information blocking, it's important to recognize, is applicable to more than just health IT developers, and there are 3 technical actors that are named in statute. One is developers of certified health IT. The next is health information exchanges. We've defined that in the proposed rule in a functional way. So if you're an organization that performs these functions, then you would be considered a health information exchange. Similarly to health information networks, if you're a health information network, you would be doing these certain functions that we've laid out in the proposed rule. If you meet those functions, regardless of the name that may be attributed to the particular type of organization that you are in healthcare, you would meet the definition of a health information network pursuant to the statute and our proposed regulation, and you would be covered by the information blocking related provisions. The important component for these 3 actors is that by law, the HHS Office of the Inspector General, who does a lot of the kind of fraud, abuse, waste enforcement for HHS, was given authority by Congress to enforce this information blocking related provision and levy penalties up to $1 million per violation for organizations in the first 3 categories there that are considered information blockers. And so the process going forward that you would expect once we finalize the rule would be that someone would complain, OIG would investigate, there would likely be either some kind of settlement or actual, full drawn-out process where the organization would be fined, and then the, fact pattern associated with that case, like you may have seen or experienced with FTC or some of the other commissions that bring enforcement actions like this, where there's a fact pattern and a scenario by which information blocking would have occurred, then that would be exposed for the rest of the industry to learn from and not repeat those kind of same mistakes, so to speak. And that's the paradigm that was set up by the law. Our role as part of the executive branch was to implement the exceptions, right? So we're trying to figure out what's workable for industry in this case in order to continue to comply with the law. The 4th actor in the scheme of things is healthcare providers. It's a pretty expansive definition of healthcare provider. Since I'm based in Washington, D.C., the saying that I like to say from a tongue-in-cheek perspective is that definitions matter. So depending on the particular statute that you may be operating in, you may have a definition of healthcare provider that's quite narrow. So there could be a definition of healthcare provider for a CMS program that is just some subset of particular hospitals that are covered by CMS for that particular law, because that's what Congress is focused on. In this case, our definition for healthcare provider is, again, quite expansive. And we included a description of that in the proposed rule, so I'd encourage you to check that out. It includes probably more than your typical, just colloquial definitions of healthcare provider, and that is a body of law related to going through all the various statutes that are referenced by our definition of healthcare provider, which is in the Public Health Service Act, not in some of the other laws that are out there. All right. So that's the gist of information blocking. Covers a wide range, a lot of different actors in the healthcare ecosystem. When we come to the conditions of certification, it fits within the information blocking paradigm. So you can look at it as an umbrella information blocking or as an underlying kind of support structure. But either way, in terms of how you want to approach things, the API condition of certification fits within that paradigm. So you could have situations where someone complies with the overall parameters in the API condition of certification, but they still engage in something else that would violate the information blocking related provision. And so you kind of have the two layers to consider, especially for health IT developers. And the API condition of certification, just like I mentioned earlier, applies only in the context of our certification program into health IT developers. So it's kind of a narrowing funnel effect in terms of who's covered by the API condition of certification. The reference in the Cures Act that I'll cover in a little bit more detail is that these APIs that need to be published by health IT developers need to be done so without special effort. And so if you've heard Dr. Rucker speak, the national coordinator, we go on at length about what without special effort could mean at the time before the proposed rule went out. When we laid out the proposed rule, we really looked at three different types of things that could constitute special effort and then developed policies that would address those. So one is around transparency, so making sure that documentation and other terms and conditions and business practices are made available to other health IT developers, app developers, et cetera. So there's kind of an openness aspect to that. The second area is around fees. And this is where there's an intersection between information blocking and the API condition of certification. I have a lot of detail in some subsequent slides, so I don't want to cover that right now. And then the last is around pro-competitive conditions. So we hear anecdotes and instances throughout our time developing the proposed rule where health IT developers in this case would not be favorably supportive of other app developers, third parties, because they may be developing a solution that would be a competitor of theirs in the market, and they would engage in practices that would otherwise thwart that entrant into the marketplace to compete with a particular service that they had in mind. So we have some openness and pro-competitive conditions as well that are sub-conditions as part of the API condition. And then lastly, there we go, the technical requirements associated with the API. This is a great conference to be at because you all are talking about many of the things that we've proposed. I'll cover them in a little bit more detail as well. But nonetheless, just as a bottom line, we reference FHIR as the base standard. I'll talk a little bit more about the versioning aspect of FHIR that we include in the rule for security and other types of aspects about app interaction, the Smart App Launch Framework, OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and then also support for provider uses as well as patient access uses. And that's important as a juxtaposition to the 2015 edition, which largely was deployed and implemented for patient access. Now, we've returned back to a focus of including both support for providers as it relates to their uses and increased usability and efficiency, as well as continuing the journey for patient access related use cases. All right, so now I'm going to start down the deep dive for the API condition certification. First part is, for this particular portion of the proposed rule, we included a unique terminology that we use to help identify the particular organizations or entities that would be involved. And so the who here that we reference, we have API technology suppliers, and that translates to EHR developers that get certified through our program. They're the ones that are supplying API technology. You're going to keep that in mind. API data providers. So often you have a health IT developer that may be developing FHIR server in this case, and I'll get to that in a second, but the FHIR server doesn't have any data. So the ones that are the data providers are in effect in the US, for those of you that are internationally, right? They're the hospitals, the ambulatory providers that actually are the stewards of our patient data. And then you have API users, which can be healthcare organizations, as I mentioned earlier, providers that are using third-party apps, patients that are using third-party apps, other persons and entities, app developers that fall into that user category that interact with APIs. So the what here that we're really talking about in terms of what's being regulated is FHIR servers. So for those that will be developing FHIR servers, we have both technical requirements that would be applicable to them, as well as an overarching set of business practices that would be applied to FHIR server developers. And one more kicker here. How this is applied, we have a modular certification program that we operate, and so there are many different certification criteria that apply in different contexts. The easiest example here would be if you're a health IT developer and you focus on e-prescribing, and that's your jam, right? That's your niche focus. We wouldn't require that you have to comply with this API condition of certification because you're not getting certified to any API certification criteria. So that's one of the kind of statutory execution components. It's a bit of a nuance, but I wanted to explain that it isn't always going to be applicable to all health IT developers as a whole. All right. Important policy context. as your Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, we work with many other agencies in HHS, one of which is the Office for Civil Rights that you may be most familiar with from a HIPAA privacy rule perspective, HIPAA enforcement. They have recently issued a new set of FAQs. You can access them at the bottom of the hyperlink at the bottom of the slide. I snuck that one in there. I know it's really busy. It's just meant to show that there's lots of FAQs now that are available. The ones on the right were the ones that they've issued in the past several weeks, which get to the patient right of access under HIPAA, apps and APIs, and it covers covered entity liability. It covers the security practices, whether or not a covered entity can refuse to disclose the EPHI to an app developer. I'd encourage you to check out the FAQs available on the Office for Civil Rights. They do, hopefully will help clear the path, clear any confusion up, give you an authoritative source to reference if you encounter any of the HIPAA mythology that usually is used to prevent access to patient data. All right. So for the certification criteria itself, in the 2015 edition, we had a functionally specified certification criteria. It didn't reference any particular standards, but it had some kind of basic requirements. It had a set of data, which we referred to as the Common Clinical Data Set, that needed to be made accessible via via APIs. And it was up to the developer as they got certified through the 2015 edition to pick whatever API standard that they wanted. So they could implement a proprietary way for their APIs, or they could implement an industry standard way, and many chose to use FHIR for their 2015 edition certification. I'll show you some statistics that you've probably seen for the US heat map again. But suffice it to say, we really stepped through a set of 7 functionalities or capabilities that we included in our certification criteria related to app registration, secure connections, data response and search, all those things that you would expect to minimally test a FHIR server for conformance capability to FHIR. As a bottom line, as part of our proposals, we wanted to meet the industry where it was best capable of really taking off and going forward as fast as possible. A lot of this gets down to regulatory strategy, when we're drafting the rules, what's going on in industry. We started working on these over 2 years ago, before R4 was released, right before R3 was released. So there's a lot of timing in terms of the cadence of the standards work that goes on throughout HL7, the work that you all do to help advance implementation experience, but then the kind of regulatory tail that follows along behind. So at the time that we put together our policy proposals and got everything cleared, our focus was on FHIR Release 2, DSTU2, Argonaut specification. Most of the industry had coalesced around that, and that seemed like the best proposal to go forward with, and somewhat, to say in a different way, the kind of least regret option related to the most experience that the industry had available today, most deployed footprint, et cetera. All right. In terms of the data that would be made available as part of that FHIR-based API that we proposed, you've probably heard reference to the US Core Data for Interoperability. That's an evolution and a replacement for what's currently in our rule as the Common Clinical Data Set. And so we've expanded it to include clinical notes. We've also included reference to provenance. And so there's certain information that you can expect to see going forward if we were to finalize this as proposed. That would be an expansion of the data that is currently available through 2015 edition APIs. And then we're also looking toward working through a public-private process to help expand the US CDI over time. So making it a way to start to lay out a roadmap and a trajectory for more and more data to be available via FHIR-based APIs, at least in the US. And that's one of the things that we do as part of our non-regulatory role, actively participate in HL7. I'm part of the US Realm Steering Committee and help to guide the US core profiles that are referenced in the US Realm as part of HL7. All right. The one other thing, just a public service announcement, since Rob's here as well. In Hood, in between the 4 and 5 o'clock time period, we're going to have a more detailed dive on the FHIR server testing tool that ONC is invested in. And I would just, without stealing too much of his thunder, highly encourage you to go to that. It's available today. It includes R2, full suite or stack of Argonaut implementation, smart-related capabilities for testing FHIR servers. And so if you'd like to test a FHIR server, this tool is for you. We have both a certification program edition, which is more focused on regulatory compliance and kind of helping industry stakeholders understand what they would need to ultimately do in order to get certified. And then we also have what we're calling a community edition, which is really more of everyone here that wants to test fire servers or add something in, has a different implementation guide that you think would be valuable to test. Please get in touch with us, find Rob or anybody else on the MITRE team. We have a long-term investment in making sure that there are testing resources available for the community related to fire, and very much open for business in terms of making sure that we can continue to support the implementation needs and implementation experience from a conformance testing perspective. It's one of those things where nobody wants to individually invest in, and that's where your government here is here to help, so to speak, when it comes to fire testing. All right. Again, as I mentioned, fire implementation nationwide. This is a map for hospitals in terms of their market share. It's grouped in the gerrymandered quadrants here that you can kind of see. You've got hospital referral regions, so it's a way that some health economists look at the United States relative to particular regions, medical trading areas, and the like. The darkest red, the kind of deep red shade there, are hospital referral regions where all of the hospitals in that region have a health IT developer as their underlying technology provider that's been certified to fire as part of their 2015 edition. And so in those areas, it's likely some combination of Epic or Cerner or Meditech, in terms of some of the biggies in the top 5 for hospital-related health IT developers. And all the hospitals in those regions, again, have fire-based APIs. So just when you look at the top 10 health IT developers by market share from a CMS attestations perspective, you get a little bit over 80% in terms of the amount, an asymmetry about the kind of market share and market distribution. When you look at that from a numbers perspective, there are roughly 5,000 hospitals to kind of make the math easy. So over 4,000 of those have a health IT developer that this year, if not already, has been deploying or working to deploy a fire server pursuant to the 2015 edition and the CMS EHR incentive program, now called Promoting Interoperability Programs, related compliance requirements. Ambulatory is a little bit lower, but still nonetheless above 50%. I'm going to go into the deep dive part of the API conditions. We also have maintenance to certification requirements, which I'll touch on in a bit as well. This is from the statute, so if you want to read the language of the law, this is what the law says. So we read this the same as everybody else, and then we have to write many pages to explain how you would actually follow this and comply with the provisions of the law. And again, the bottom line, in this case, we substituted kind of health IT developer for API technology supplier, has an obligation to publish as a condition of certification APIs, make them available and to be used to access, exchange, and use, and that's that phrase that's used in the statute quite a bit, and that they be used without special effort. So we start to lay out what special effort would constitute. And again, as I mentioned in some of my upfront slides, we first started to focus on transparency. And so we have specific conditions or subconditions, as I like to refer to them, that relate to transparency, terms and conditions, fees, and the structure and methodology associated with those fees that could be made available. As you look at other APIs that are made available in other industries, if there is a fee structure associated with them and a methodology, that's usually publicly accessible so that app developers know, if I'm going to start to commercialize this, here's what it's going to start to cost me from a bottom line perspective as I scale. And then if there is an app developer and a verification process associated with the authenticity of the app developer, they have to be clear about what those requirements would be. So that's the transparency aspect. The permitted fees category is how we describe that. There are only specific types of fees that are permitted pursuant to our proposals. They must be objective and have verifiable criteria. There are 3 categories of permitted fees, and I'm going to cover those in great detail, I should say. And then there needs to be continued record keeping associated with those fees as well. And so one of the other dynamics, just to put you in my shoes for a second, is as much fun as it is to dive into the technical aspects of things, we also have an obligation to taxpayers, to the rest of the American public, to enforce the laws once they're written, once they're implemented. And there's a component of going through all this regulatory process that largely in any kind of situation, there could be 80-20, 90-10, there will be enforcement actions that we will need to take in the future. And often we need to lay out proposals that not only can serve as a guiding clarity for regulatory compliance, but also serve as the backstop for when we do need to take enforcement action. There needs to be clear and kind of objective, non-arbitrary ways in which to make sure that our enforcement actions can be put forward. So a lot of the proposals that we have here, you can kind of look through both lenses, making sure that once you lay out the rule, for those of you that are parents, if the rule is not followed, then there are consequences associated with them, and you need to explain how those consequences are put into effect. The last related to the subconditions here for openness and pro-competitive. The kind of bottom line or overarching philosophy for this subcondition is that for the API technology supplier, they would need to be able to grant API data providers, so their customers in this case, sole authority and autonomy to use the API as their customer sees fit. So a lot of the feedback that we received up to issuing this rule was, yes, we received this technology, but health IT developers in some cases have made it difficult for us to choose third parties with whom we want to partner. And so this provision is meant to identify there are clear relationships between the different actors that I named, API technology suppliers, API data providers, and then the API users. And I'll start to show how those split out. All right, and then related to the maintenance of certification provisions, the slide's fully built now if you want to take a picture. The statute also envisions a component of the conditions of certification not only being what you need to do in order to get certified, but what you need to do to keep your certification over time. And so related to this API condition of certification, we include some maintenance of certification requirements. The first of which, probably the most important, is the publication of API endpoints, so to speak, the service-based URLs. Health IT developers would have an obligation to make sure that all of their customer endpoints are made publicly available in some means. We include in the proposed rule that we'd like to see industry coalesce around ways to centralize that kind of information, to make it easier for app developers and others in the community to get access to APIs at an easier scale, so to speak, as opposed to going to each health IT developer and kind of looking at their customer lists that may ultimately be made publicly available. And then the other maintenance certification requirement that we proposed was that health IT developers roll these out to their customers within 24 months of the final rule. And so it's really, if you start back to the proposal that we had and then the time that it's going to take us to finalize the rule, likely a 3-year lead time, so to speak, in terms of from the first awareness that, hey, this is coming, there's proposals, here are the boundary conditions associated with these proposals, what you may need to do, to the implementation timeline and rollout to providers. There's certainly a level of cadence. I wouldn't call it impatience, but expectation that this would be rolled out more quickly given the amount of industry experience with FHIR and the deployment footprint that you've already seen from my prior slide. All right. So I've done a few of these presentations via webinars, and this may be one of the last ones that I do because the proposed rule kind of comment period is over. I spent a lot of time on some animation, which you will enjoy. And so I'm using this one last time to go through. So we have the 3 actors that we've got as part of the condition of certification. Bottom left, you can translate to the EHR developer. That's the API technology supplier. The top, you have the healthcare organizations who are their customers. And then to the right are everybody who's going to be using that API. So our condition of certification, again, as a quick reminder, applies to the API technology supplier, highlighted there. And then the first thing to keep in mind is, in terms of this is a different kind of 2-dimensional way to look at information blocking. The relationships here for all the different actors, information blocking applies in all these cases. So you have information blocking possibilities between the API technology supplier and API data providers, so those healthcare organizations in those kind of contexts. You have information blocking potential between the API technology supplier, third-party apps, other patients that may be accessing their data. And then similarly, because healthcare providers are also covered by the information blocking provisions, you have information blocking potential issues between API data providers and other third parties, including patients. Right? So if a healthcare organization refuses to give a patient their data, not only is that illegal, but that would be something that would also potentially violate the information blocking provision as well. And so you have this kind of information blocking triangle, and then we start to fill it in. The API conditions of certification apply in the relationships between, since you know that now that they only apply to the health IT developer, but we can govern the health IT developer and its relationships with other players in industry. And so how the health IT developer, the API technology supplier, relates to its customers is covered by the conditions of certification, as well as how the API technology supplier relates to third-party applications and others that may seek to use the APIs also applies in the conditions of certification. Yes. So the consumer, just to repeat the question, so consumers would be bundled in as part of the third-party application that they may be designating their data to be sent, would fit into the API user category. They would fit in that picture as well. Apple, yes, correct, or any other third-party application, because it's almost by process of elimination, so to speak. Apple is not going to be a healthcare provider, or some other third-party company. They're not going to be a healthcare provider that would be getting certified technology kind of delivered to them and for deployment, and they wouldn't be certified health IT developers. So it's by process of elimination, so to speak, anyone that isn't a healthcare organization that receives certified API technology and that isn't the one getting the API technology certified would otherwise be categorized as an API user. Yep. You would be an API technology supplier if you get your product certified through our program. That was it, if he was an EHR company. I see we've jumped into questions.
Will there be certification requirements for apps?
No, not through ONC's program.
Okay.
We do have general authority to certify health IT, but for the purposes of our certification program and the certification criteria that we've proposed, it distinctly applies to Fire servers.
Repeat the question for the recording.
Sure. The question was whether apps would be certified. So as a general matter, the kind of app ecosystem out there is not touched by our regulatory proposals.
So just from that question, so the health IT providers today have programs where they validate apps before they let them use their APIs. Which part of this regulation addresses that part, or the amount of time or their decision that they can make on the app being able to allow or access the data for these regulations?
Can we hold that?
Yeah.
All right, because I'm going to answer your question. So the question was about app developer, let's say vetting, for lack of a better word, to make it colloquial, if vetting was a colloquial word, verifying app developers or their software itself. And we kind of break that into two pieces. There's the actual scrutinizing the app itself and verifying the authenticity of the organization or person behind the app. And so our rule focuses on the latter, actually, just to kind of teaser for that. Okay, so have I satisfied all questions on this part of the triangle so far? All right. When am I over? 5 minutes?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh, okay.
Before I have more questions.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I know these are probably a little bit tiny, but there are two permitted fees in terms of how the fees get distributed. The permitted fees kind of construct get distributed. Two are applicable between the relationship that exists for, I'll just say, EHR developers, API, so Fire server developers, let me call them that, and their customers, the ones that get Fire servers deployed in their deployment enterprise ecosystem. One is around development, deployment, and upgrade. And so we wanted to make sure that there were reasonable returns on investment for continued development on the health IT developer side. And so the permitted fee is available for health IT developers to charge those related costs. The second is around API usage costs. That's obviously another, once the system is deployed, once the API, the Fire server is deployed, then you have increasing volumes and scale related issues in terms of making sure that the Fire server can continue to support additional API calls. If there's a really popular app that all your patients are using, that may increase the volume and service levels that may need to be deployed underneath for that Fire server. And then the last one at the bottom there is what we call value-added services, and I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail as well. All right, that was my fancy animation. So we have two different scenarios in terms of how these types of things break down related to the conditions of certification, information blocking, and permitted fees. All right, so general conditions. We had two choices in terms of how we approach this from a policy perspective. And so when you again, step in my shoes and you sit in my office and at the 7th floor of the ivory tower of the Switzer building in Washington, D.C., you say, all right, we know that fees often serve as an impediment to access to data. We want to make sure that there are appropriate boundary conditions around the ways in which fees are approached from a regulatory perspective. It's complicated, but we have kind of two choices. We can take an approach that says every time someone asks whether a certain type of fee is okay, then we have to go through a process to adjudicate and figure out, yeah, that fee is okay. We understand that that's an okay fee. And that puts us into a perpetual guidance mode, which isn't really great because it creates a level of uncertainty that's quite high in industry where you don't know if the type of fee that you want to use is going to be ultimately approved by the regulating entity. The approach that we took instead was to start off with almost kind of a clean slate and say, you're not allowed to charge any fees because fees by their nature would constitute special effort. But we recognized that that wasn't a practical solution as well, and so we started to chip away at that general construct of no fees at all to say what are the types of fees categorically that would allow for continued reinvestment and innovation by EHR developers, fire server developers, continued competition in the market, and other types of value-added services. And so that's really where we started to, and I'm going to build this whole thing out. We have a general set of parameters around the permitted fees. A lot of this is reflective and common with some of the information blocking language that we reference as well in our rule. So ensuring that the fees are objective and verifiable, that they're reasonably related to the API technology supplier, that they're allocated reasonably to all customers, so kind of the cost distribution, and that the fees aren't based on whether the API user or other actor engaged in the process would be a potential competitor, right? And so the scenario here would be we charge one rate to app developers that don't have competing services with us, and we charge another rate to app developers that do have competing services with us, right? And so you start to see asymmetries in terms of how, in this case, API technology suppliers could approach different types of fees. All right. So related to the first permitted fee in this top level scenario, we've got all three actors involved. The API technology supplier would be permitted to charge fees related to and recover their costs incurred for development, deployment, and upgrade. So everything you need to do to build a Fire server and get it in the hands of your customers. Those would be the types of fees that we're allowed to be charged. The other caveat here that I note in terms of the API technology supplier not being able to charge a permitted fee, instances that we heard from stakeholders in the field, they wanted to partner with a particular third party. And again, this relates back to one of the other provisions that I referenced. The provider would not have the autonomy to just simply negotiate a contract for that third party to interact with their API. They actually had to go back to the health IT developer and request permission in a kind of mother may I mode in order to gain access to their own API. And so what we attempted to do through our proposals is to separate those concerns and say, there's a set of relationships around acquiring API technology and making sure that it's ready to be deployed. But then there's another set of relationships that should be governed solely by the healthcare organization with whom they have the data and any other third party that they want to interact with. All right. Second one is associated with API usage costs. Again, I kind of covered that in detail. The only other things I would note here is that if the API technology supplier fully deploys the Fire server to a healthcare organization, let's say it's a large hospital system and they have an IT staff that can run the whole thing, then this permitted fee would be off the table for an API technology supplier because they're not doing any of the hosting or kind of absorbing any of the usage costs associated with the permitted fee. All right. I'm running low on time here. There's a few things that we exclude from the particular API usage costs. Again, there for your reference. The one thing that I would note is that when it comes to patient access to their health information, we specifically excluded that as an option for charging usage costs in terms of API volume. So if you have patient access across the network or over the wire, and that is incurred in terms of various API calls, those would be prohibited from being factored into the API usage costs. All right. The other area here, which starts to get at the last question that the gentleman asked earlier. So for the value-added services category, and this gets to Eric's question about earlier too, for all the actors or persons and entities that don't fit within being a healthcare provider that is deploying a Fire server, or a health IT developer that is the one building a Fire server, they fit into this API user category. And so we wanted to say, for health IT developers, the API technology suppliers, there's many opportunities for them to add valuable services in the ecosystem that may be unique to their, let's call it ecosystem, or that they may want to offer as a general matter. So that could include in this third bullet here, if they have specific distribution channels, enhanced integration testing. We don't focus on write capabilities as part of certification at the moment. So if a health IT developer wanted to offer some special badge of having gone through, X developers write integration, it's not going to crash your system, warrants and warranty and all that jazz. They could be, they could do that as a value-added service, and that would be permitted. We wanted to make sure that was permitted as part of our proposals, co-marketing arrangements and other things. We do allow for the construct of an app store or some other kind of, a health IT developer specific ecosystem, but you have to kind of keep that in mind with the juxtaposition of the condition of certification and information blocking related policies. And so we have a specific scenario down at the bottom here that if, as a precondition, an app developer were required to go through a paid listing process in order to be deployed and generally accessible, which is some of the terminology that we reference in our rule, in order for the API technology supplier's customers to use it, right? So preventing access to that customer market by virtue of requiring a fee to be paid, that would be in violation of the larger set of proposals that we included in the proposed rule. I'm going to get to the backup slide that I had to answer your question last. We included some requests for comment, recognizing earlier, as I mentioned, we proposed a full slate of requirements around Fire Release 2. We knew that there were 2 other versions of Fire or releases of Fire that were out there that industry would like to comment on. I'm sure, given that I've talked to many of you that are in the crowd, folks commented on the Release 4 of Fire. That's something that we're going to look at. There's an element where we laid out all these 4 options, seeking comment from industry in terms of what would be best, for us to choose for a final rule. There are other details in here that we referenced, things I didn't touch on related to refresh tokens and some of the OAuth 2 flow that we requested comment on as well. And for those of you that are big fans of dynamic client registration, we also had a request for comment in there as well. So let me jump to, let me see if this is the transparency, openness. So this, I think, is going to answer gentleman's question to the last part. So on the right side here, as part of our openness and pro-competitive conditions, we require that an API technology supplier must grant rights to the API data providers and their API users that may be reasonably necessary to access and use the API technology. And then on the right side here, we lay out a whole list of things that the API technology supplier would not be permitted to do as a condition of their certification, and in granting those rights on the left that we described. So they would not be allowed to require that an API user, for instance, pay a fee to license the rights, not compete, right? So they wouldn't be able to have a non-compete related clause as a precondition for approving an app or something along those lines, that they would only deal exclusively with that API technology supplier. And so there are a number of other particular requirements there that we included to try to help level the playing field and make an open and competitive marketplace. There is one more that I wanted to get to. The right side here as well gets to some of the non-discriminatory terms. So I'd encourage you to, there's a slide deck if you want to see like a more less rushed, more open discussion of this, I did a webinar. It's on healthit.gov. It covers all these slides in great detail. There's one element that I was trying to get to real quick. Let me go back to, sorry about that. Too much animation now. This is what's going to get me. Oh, there we go. OK. So the first part here, the first bullet under maintenance and certification, so the bottom blue box there, we have a paradigm in the proposed rule where health IT developers, so in this case API technology suppliers, are permitted to verify the authenticity of the app developer, if they so choose. And that is the, are you a live company or person? Are you operating a business? Whatever those parameters may be, we did set a requirement that they had to complete that within 5 business days. And then upon completing that within 5 business days, they had to effectively issue your client ID and your client secret as may be applicable, and register with register the app and make that available within 1 day of having concluded that verification, or I should say, authenticity verification process, right? So the distinction that I made earlier, just to be really clear, there is no kind of room or proposal permission for health IT developers to vet the applications themselves related to what the app is doing. As we included some of the other provisions that I referenced, whether or not it would be a competitor of theirs, they just can't take that into consideration as part of their process. So with that, thank you very much. Stephen.posnack@hts.gov. I know we're at time. Happy to answer any questions. I'll be around all day today, all day tomorrow. Please come to the Inferno session at 4 o'clock if you're interested in fire server testing.